China had a long and glorious past before the changes of the 19th and 20th centuries. The World History Encyclopedia says that China is the world's oldest culture that is still around today. China's long-term success has been tied to its determination to keep its society in line at all costs. This brings up the issue of law and penalties. People have long been interested in the terrible things that happened to criminals in ancient and Imperial China. This is mostly because of the strange ways they abuse people. As an example, a prisoner is held down over a bamboo seed as part of the bamboo torture. So, over the next few days, the bamboo shoot grows and slowly pricks the prisoner. Another is the notorious water torture, which could include anything from dripping water on someone's head to dunking their head in water. In ancient and later Imperial China, how inmates were treated wasn't really about doing what was right, but about getting rid of any kind of opposition in society. Let's look at what it was really like to be a prisoner in China in the past. Prisoners in China were treated pretty much the same way over the course of millennia. If this movie is about China in the past, then why do we also talk about Imperial China? It may sound strange, but a prisoner in Imperial China's criminal justice system in the early 20th century had to follow the same rules and goals as a criminal in China in the 2nd century BC. The Confucianization of law and the lenient punishments in China says that China's penal code and its intellectual foundations stayed the same from the Han dynasty to the end of the Qing dynasty. There were some changes over the years, but they were more due to the historical circumstances of the time than to a complete shift in beliefs about who should be locked up and why. Because of this, sentences were given to people who lived hundreds of years apart. This was because the law was based on spiritual ideas that were important in Chinese culture until the 20th century. The criminal justice system was influenced by Confucianism and legalism. Britannica says that the first imperial law codes of an organized Chinese state were made when Shi Huangdi became the first emperor of the Qin dynasty and ruled by himself in 221 BC. How strict was Qin's rule? The World History Encyclopedia talks about how many men, women, and children who did not follow the law were burned at the stake and killed. Legalism was the main idea that ran Qin China. People in this school of thought that people were bad by nature. People thought that laws should be simple, harsh, and effective in order to make society peaceful and safe for the weak. The ruler should hold the power and wield it like lightning or thunder, wrote Han Feizi, the founder of legalism. The laws were very strict, and people who were found guilty could be tortured, made to work, or killed. People were usually put to death by being beheaded, but sometimes their bodies were torn apart by chariots or boiled in a pot. Prisoners were thought to be guilty until they were proven innocent. With laws like that, it's easy to see why the Han dynasty beat the Qin dynasty in 206 BC. The Han era changed the penal code to reflect Confucianism's ideas, but legalism's ideas still had a big impact on it. The worst crime in ancient China was to disobey your parents. The criminal law of ancient China stressed filial piety in 5 main relationships: how people should treat their rulers, parents, spouses, brothers, and friends. This meant that prisoners who did the same kind of crime would be punished in different ways based on whether they did it to a senior or junior, husband or father, or other family member. In ancient China, a prisoner who did something wrong to an older person would get a harsher sentence than someone who did the same wrong to a younger person. Parents were punished with their child if they turned in a parent for a crime, unless the crime was treason or rebellion. This was done to show how important filial love was. Throughout the history of Imperial China, this criminal rule was in effect. It shows how prisoners were treated differently by talking about the death penalty in traditional China. In the year 1831, a woman named Mrs. Han hurt her father-in-law by mistake, which led to his death. For that kind of crime, people had to be killed by cutting. More on that later. But out of kindness, the ruler changed the sentence to the more humane death by decapitation. In addition, Mrs. Han had a baby while she was waiting for her sentence. The rule said she could take care of her child for 100 days before she was beheaded. Torture was used regularly against prisoners in ancient China. In ancient and royal China, one of the most important rules of law was that a prisoner had to admit to a crime in order to be found guilty. At first glance, this might sound good if you were a prisoner on trial. You might not tell everyone that you stole your neighbor's chickens and get away with it. Not so fast. According to the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, it was okay for the police to torture people to get them to admit. However, a prisoner could freely admit that they did the crime before they were tortured. If that's the case, then the law says that the sentence should be less rigid. The Qing dynasty closed this gap completely. Their laws said that if you admitted to a crime before it was discovered, you would not be punished, but you would have to pay for any losses. It was also possible to admit to a crime and then find out you were also guilty of a lesser crime. If this happened, you were only punished for the bigger crimes and not the smaller ones. People who break the law could even send someone to the police to admit on their behalf. There were times when this kind of leniency didn't apply, like when the crime was murder, serious hurt, or damage to property that couldn't be fixed. But a lot of prisoners didn't tell, so judges would beat them. Ancient China tortured prisoners and witnesses to get confessions. In old China, the whole process of investigating and judging crimes was very strict. During the whole process, both witnesses and the accused would kneel down in front of a judge. Duhaime says that leading questions will be asked of the suspects. If the prisoners tried to avoid being questioned, the authorities would quickly start torturing them. At this point, the way torture is done is very basic and straight. The arms of a prisoner or witness who wouldn't cooperate were wrapped around a pole. Then they were beaten over and over while they said they were innocent. There were times when a prisoner who had been wrongfully tortured confessed. But overall, reform and development of powers and functions of China's criminal proceedings says that the system of torture helped to get proof faster, solve cases, and lower the cost of investigations. Chen said, "In criminal cases, the interrogation, which mainly aimed at obtaining the defendant's confession, became the main means of judicial proof, which laid basis for the prevalence of extortion of confessions by torture. For that reason, detectives thought that torturing people was an important part of their job." Convicted criminals in ancient China rarely actually went to prison. Let's say you were found guilty of a crime in China a long time ago. What took place? Did people think prisoners would change, or did they think they would be punished? In ancient China, the criminal law was seen as the guardian of Confucian morals and values, and its job was to keep society in order. A person thought that laws were an important part of society's morals, and if you broke the law, you would get what you earned. Despite this, the Confucianization of law and the lenient punishments in China says that Confucianism expected leaders to act morally and that harsh punishments should only be used as a last option. However, punitive compliance always happened a lot. According to the death penalty in traditional China, most of the punishments in Imperial China were either physical or lethal. There were prisons, and sometimes prisoners were locked up, but most of the time, inmates were punished physically for their crimes. This meant that prisoners could be put to death or tortured based on how bad their crime was. Duhaime says that a lot of the punishments were just mean and strange. As a punishment, people were often whipped or caned in front of a judge. It was also done with chains and tools that locked the neck or strapped a heavy stone to it. All of these different kinds of punishments fit into one of the 5 punishments. Prisoners in ancient China were subjected to one of the 5 punishments. As explained in the death penalty in traditional China, China had a way of punishing prisoners called the Wu Xing, which means 5 punishments. Depending on the act, you could get one of the 5 types of punishments. In China before the Qin era, the 5 punishments were getting a tattoo, having your nose cut off, having one or both feet cut off, being castrated, and being killed. During the Sui dynasty, 581 to 618 CE, the 5 punishments changed over time. They included beating with a light stick, beating with a heavy stick, prison time, banishment, and death by strangulation or decapitation. Different levels of punishment were present in each one. For instance, a prisoner who was ordered to be hit with a light stick could be given one of 5 levels of punishment, each of which determined the number of hits that would be given, between 10 and 50. People who were sentenced to exile went farther away if they were found guilty of a more serious crime. Decapitation was thought to be worse than choking as a way to kill someone. This may seem odd, since strangling, in which a rope was wrapped around the throat, was a very painful and long method of death. A head cutting, on the other hand, only needed a skilled swing of the sword. However, cutting off someone's head was seen as more rude and low to a body that had been given to them by their ancestors, making it a more shameful way to die. The death by 1,000 cuts was the worst punishment possible for a prisoner. The death penalty in traditional China talks about how the 5 punishments changed over time to become some pretty horrible ways to treat people. Britannica says that the Lingchi has been around since the 10th century. It is also known as death by slicing, or death by 1,000 cuts. People thought that Lingchi was the worst sentence that could be given to a prisoner. These terrible things happened to people who had only done the worst crimes in the land, which were called the 10 abominations. Treason, mutilation, patricide, death of a husband, rebellion, and witchcraft were some of these. There were 8 slices to the body in Lingchi, but there could be more. The face was usually the first place this happened, then the hands, feet, chest, and stomach. This was the last cut, to the heart or to the head. One English observer wrote, "This punishment is not so much torture as it is meant to ruin the offender's present and future lives. He doesn't deserve to live on as a man or as a ghost that can be seen. Since souls that want to show up must take on the bodies they used to have, he can only show up as a bunch of small pieces. The death doesn't last long, it's over in a flash, and the third cut is usually the finishing blow." In 1905, Lingchi was made illegal. Prisoners in ancient China were kept in dungeons. An Imperial Chinese jail would be like the Four Seasons, while a modern prison would be like this one. A new study on the judicial administrative system with Chinese characteristics also says that China had a prison system that started in the Qin era and grew and became more organized over the centuries. Jails and prison systems says that a stone tablet from 723 CE said that Buddhist temples should be built near Chinese jails. This was likely part of a rehabilitation program that didn't exist at the time. However, this did not make them less awful. According to the death penalty in traditional China, jails were mostly used to hold people who couldn't pay bail or had ties to the government. The accused would be locked up in these dungeons until their hearing. In addition, they would hang out with people who had been sent to jail. Only family members gave them food, and as you might expect, the guards often mistreated their charges. As stated in The Philosophy of Civil Rights in the Context of China, all new prisoners were whipped. In fact, some prisoners asked to be beaten to show how brave they were, or maybe to impress their fellow prisoners. In ancient China, prisoners were not supposed to live long. Prisoners in ancient China were never executed in the spring or summer. In old China, prisoners had to follow the philosophical ideas that guided people's spiritual views. In terms of punishments, this meant that some things could not be done. Confucian ideas and Taoist ideas about natural balance came together. People and nature were thought to be so connected that people should act in harmony with nature. What did this mean for the prisoners? People thought of spring and summer as times of growth and rebirth, while they thought of fall and winter as times of rest and loss. It says in The Death Penalty in Traditional China that, according to Chinese custom, executions could only happen in the fall or winter because they are a way to end life. It would upset the natural order if someone was put to death at the wrong time of year. During the Han Dynasty, for instance, no important cases or decisions could be made after spring. Along with the different kingdoms, the number of taboo times changed. The Tang had the most, but they couldn't execute people on wet days, at night, or during certain phases of the moon. In addition, the Buddhist schedule also said that people could not be executed during certain months and feasts. Prisoners of war in ancient China were subject to execution or enslavement. In the early days of Chinese history, if you were on the losing side of a fight and were captured, your enemy could do whatever they wanted with you. Prisoners of war were most often either sold into slavery or put to death before the Qin era. But prisoners of war were also more likely to suffer. The Journal of Anthropological Archaeology says that during that time, prisoners of war were killed as part of religious ceremonies. According to ancient China, raids were sometimes planned to find people to sacrifice. Women in Imperial China talks about how women who were taken were often raped and forced to marry the officers who had won the battle. Historical Origins of International Criminal Law also says that any prisoners caught in China 6,000 years ago might have been eaten during times of famine. Human sacrifice and eating stopped happening a long time before Imperial China was founded. After Imperial China was formed, the way prisoners of war were treated got a little better. Modern China sometimes uses the same methods against prisoners as ancient China. At least a few newspapers have said that China still treats inmates a lot of the same way it did in ancient and Imperial China. The Guardian wrote in 2021 that Chinese residents are often arrested, detained, and tortured in secret. A lot of these claims that people are tortured in modern China have to do with how the country treats its ethnic communities. The New York Times said that China has violated many people's rights in its efforts to integrate Tibetans, such as by arresting them without a reason and torturing political prisoners. Forbes actually talked about how the UN has denied claims that inmates from Falun Gong, Uyghur, Tibetan, Muslim, and Christian groups were forced to have their organs harvested. Besides these claims, inmates in China may also be abused physically or sexually, made to work, or sterilized against their will. The UN is trying to get the Chinese government to pay attention to this important human rights problem. It's crazy to think about how things for Chinese inmates have stayed the same for so long. We hope you liked this video. Watch another video here